captured or sold in Africa, transported to the coast, sold to slave traders, shipped off in a slave ship, then sold and enslaved mainly in the Americas and the Caribbeans, dehumanized into property, forced to do harsh labor, whipped, beaten, hung, damaged or chopped off limbs and body parts, branded, burnt, imprisoned, shackled, raped. You've had enough. You will fight for freedom or die trying. Dunbar, with the Black Timeline. The Underground Railroad. Operational from the early 1800s up to the Civil War. Estimated to have aided in the escape of over 100,000 enslaved African Americans. The Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes and people, African American as well as white, providing shelter and aid to escaped enslaved African Americans from southern slave states. Signs, codes, the North Star, and star constellations were also utilized. Most Underground Railroad operators were ordinary people, farmers, business owners, and ministers. Some wealthy people were involved. The passengers were the enslaved African Americans who escaped. People known as conductors were guides to the escaped African Americans. Stations, safe houses, and depots were hiding places which included private homes, churches, and schoolhouses. The people operating the safe houses were called station masters. The Fugitive Slave Acts, 2 federal laws. The first act, passed in 1793, allowed local governments to apprehend and return escaped enslaved people from within the borders of free states back to their point of origin, and to punish anyone helping them. Some northern states tried to fight this with personal liberty laws, but they were rejected by the Supreme Court. Slave catchers also kidnapped free African Americans and sold them into slavery. You may be familiar with Solomon Northup, portrayed in the movie 12 Years a Slave. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 strengthened the previous law, of course, creating harsher penalties. The Fugitive Slave Acts led to escaped African Americans heading for Canada, where slavery had been abolished from the early 1800s. Border states. Southern slave states that shared a border with free states to the north. Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. This map is of the division of the states during the Civil War. Blue represents Union free states. Light blue represents border states. Red represents Confederate slave states. The white areas were not states until after the Civil War. There were 34 states in 1861. 19 were free states and 15 were slave states. Contributors to the Underground Railroad. The lives of people who helped in the Underground Railroad, along with their families' lives, were often threatened. Even while imprisoned, they received harsh treatment. Enslavers would do such things as place a price on their heads. Frederick Douglass, often called the father of the Civil Rights Movement. Douglass escaped enslavement after several failed attempts. He was a famous anti-slavery writer and the editor and publisher of the Northern Star, an abolitionist newspaper. Douglass was the leader of the Rochester's Underground Railroad movement in New York, where he hid escaped African Americans in his home, helping around 400 of them make their way to Canada. Levi Coffin, referred to as the president of the Underground Railroad, one of the earliest known people to help the enslaved escape. His home was used to hide escaped enslaved African Americans. It is estimated that he helped around 3,000 enslaved African Americans escape. John Rankin. His house in Ohio is a National Historic Landmark and was one of the original stops on the Underground Railroad. Rankin is estimated to have helped around 2,000 enslaved African Americans escape. David Ruggles. claimed to have led more than 600 enslaved African Americans escape to freedom, including Frederick Douglass, who became a friend. Ruggles fought against kidnapping bounty hunters, also known as blackbirds, who made a living by capturing free African Americans in the North and illegally selling them into slavery. Laura Smith Haviland. Her home became the first Underground Railroad station established in Michigan. She helped in freeing thousands of escaped enslaved African Americans. Estimates range from 40,000 to 100,000 escaped African Americans passing through her home. William Still, portrayed by Leslie Odom Jr. in Harriet, who also plays Aaron Burr in the Hamilton musical. Referred to as the father of the Underground Railroad, he helped around 800 of the enslaved escape to freedom. He interviewed each person and kept records, including a brief biography. Sidney Howard Gay helped some of history's most well-known escaped African Americans, including Harriet Tubman. He recorded the stories of over 200 escaped African Americans who he and his partners helped. Some of the same escaped African Americans William Still kept records of. Martha Coffin Wright, close friend and supporter of Harriet Tubman. Her home was part of the Underground Railroad where she sheltered escaped African Americans. She was also a key organizer of the first Women's Rights Convention and a signee of the Declaration of Sentiments document at the convention. Mary Ellen Pleasant aimed to earn as much money as possible to help as many people as she could. With her wealth, she was able to provide transportation, housing, and food. She taught African Americans how to survive and succeed. She provided John Brown with the money to start the Fight at Harper's Ferry, a planned revolt against slavery. Charles Turner Torrey worked closely with free African Americans, becoming one of the first to consider them partners. He helped free around 400 enslaved African Americans. John Parker rescued the enslaved for over 15 years. He guided hundreds of the enslaved, continuing even after a bounty was placed on his head by an enslaver. He was also one of the few African Americans to patent an invention before 1900. Thomas Garrett, a friend and supporter to Harriet Tubman. Gerrit frequently provided her with shelter, meals, money, and shoes to continue her missions. Gerrit had a large shoe business, and he supplied escaped African Americans with shoes. He helped around 2,700 African Americans escape enslavement. Samuel Burris, arrested and found guilty for encouraging the enslaved to run away. He was to be sold into slavery, but abolitionist Isaac S. Flint posed as a slave buyer, bought Burris, and set him free. Calvin Fairbank, convicted twice of helping enslaved African Americans escape, and served a total of 17 years in prison. Fairbank was reported to have received around 35,000 lashes throughout his time in prison. Jonathan Walker, arrested after he was caught with a boat full of escaped enslaved African Americans that he was helping. Walker was fined and jailed by the U.S. government for a year and branded the letters SS on his hand, indicating slave stealer. John Fairfield rejected his slaveholding family to help rescue enslaved African Americans. He started by helping a childhood friend escape from his uncle's farm and eventually became involved and well-known in the abolitionist movement. He traveled posing as a slave trader. He is believed to have freed several thousand enslaved African Americans. Moses Dixon, founder of the Knights of Liberty, which was a secret organization dedicated to fighting slavery and helping the enslaved escape. Dixon claimed that the organization helped up to 70,000 enslaved African Americans escape through the Underground Railroad. It was estimated that the organization grew to around 47,000 armed men ready to carry out a revolt. The revolt was postponed and Dixon eventually changed his mind about the revolt due to signs of the Civil War. Bartholomew Fossil, a founding member of the American Anti-Slave Society. He helped around 2,000 enslaved African Americans escape. Fussell was a physician, and he provided medical services to escaped African Americans. Garrett Smith. Smith purchased an entire family of enslaved African Americans and set them free. To help African American families become self-sufficient, to isolate and protect them from escaped slave hunters, and to provide them with the property ownership that was needed to vote in New York, Smith attempted to help free African Americans live on about 120,000 acres of land he owned. John Brown. Brown believed he was an instrument of God for ending slavery in America. He felt that violence was necessary to end slavery since peaceful efforts had failed. Brown created an armed force to free enslaved people by gunpoint. He stayed with Frederick Douglass during some of the time he planned his raid. Harriet Tubman helped gather former enslaved African Americans who were willing to join his force. Brown's men were defeated and Brown was hanged. Harriet Tubman expressed her respect for Brown, stating that he had done more in dying than 100 men would in living. George Hussey Earle, Sr. A well-known lawyer and abolitionist, he voluntarily represented many escaped enslaved African Americans. He was one of the first to battle against the fugitive slave laws. Harriet Tubman, the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, referred to as Moses for helping her people escape. Warrior, hero, unmatched perseverance.